Imagine you're holding a cup of coffee in your hands. The warmth spreads through your fingers as the rich aroma fills the air. Every sip is a small, comforting luxury in your day. Now think of algebra, a tool so ingrained in modern life that it shapes everything from the computers we use to the way we communicate, work, and understand the world. And when you head to a hospital, surgery techniques you might take for granted are deeply rooted in centuries-old innovations. But what if I told you that all of this, coffee, algebra, modern surgery, was brought to you by a man whose name you may have never even heard? A man who gave the world the very tools that still impact your life today, yet died forgotten and in poverty. This inventor, whose pioneering work shaped the course of history, is buried in obscurity. His genius was a well-kept secret, erased from history by the very society that benefited from his breakthroughs. You see, while his contributions are still felt in nearly every part of the modern world, his legacy was lost, hidden in the shadows of time. You probably think the great advancements in mathematics and medicine were driven by European minds, people like Newton, Galileo, and Da Vinci. But here's what most people don't realize. The genius who shaped algebra as we know it, who helped bring coffee to Europe, and whose surgical tools saved lives across the world, was not a European. He was a brilliant Muslim inventor whose name is rarely mentioned in Western textbooks. His legacy almost entirely erased. The irony is staggering. The world still relies on his inventions today, but for centuries his identity was buried in the sand, overshadowed by history's selective memory. This man, who gave us what we now see as fundamental advancements in science and culture, was swept aside, lost in a wave of cultural amnesia. Why, you might wonder, would someone who changed the world so dramatically end up forgotten and poor? Why are the names of many Muslim inventors erased from the annals of history while the West claims the credit for their work? What happened to his story? How did history fail to remember the true origin of the tools we still use every day? The answers lie in a tale of cultural erasure, systemic forgetting, and an era when the Islamic world was deliberately overlooked by European scholars. The Forgotten Inventor's story is not just about lost history. It's about the need to reclaim what's been stolen, to correct the record, and to honor the true architects of civilization. And as we dive deeper into his life, we'll uncover how this forgotten genius sparked revolutions in the very foundations of mathematics, medicine, and even your morning cup of coffee. But the real question isn't what they achieved. It's what happened to all of this knowledge when the darkness began to fall. The year is 750 AD. The Islamic world is on the cusp of a golden age. In the heart of Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, intellectuals from every corner of the Muslim empire are coming together in an unparalleled gathering of minds. Scholars, philosophers, mathematicians, and physicians are converging in this bustling city, their work blossoming like a garden in full bloom. Here, knowledge from ancient Greek, Persian, Indian, and Egyptian traditions is being synthesized, transformed, and expanded. This is the era where algebra, groundbreaking surgery, and innovations in daily life like coffee are being pioneered. But what you might not realize is that while this intellectual revolution is unfolding, much of it is being quietly erased from history, specifically by the European scholars who would later lay claim to these inventions and ideas. The Islamic Golden Age, from roughly the 8th to the 14th century, was a time of extraordinary scientific progress. It was here that scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, Avicenna, and Al-Razi laid the foundation for modern mathematics, medicine, and physics. But at the time, these developments were overshadowed in Europe by a deliberate historical blind spot. The term algebra, for instance, comes from the Arabic word al-jabr, which means reunion of broken parts, a term coined by the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, who lived in Baghdad in the early 9th century. Yet in the West, this critical field of mathematics was often attributed to European thinkers such as René Descartes or even the ancient Greeks, with little recognition of the Islamic intellectual heritage. What does it mean for an entire civilization's contributions to be forgotten? To understand the depth of this erasure, we need to explore how the transmission of knowledge worked during this time. Intellectual centers like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo became hubs of scholarly activity, where Muslim scholars translated and preserved ancient texts that would otherwise have been lost to history. They didn't just preserve Greek and Roman knowledge, they expanded upon it. In medicine, for example, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine became the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. And yet, despite these advancements, much of the knowledge was either ignored or attributed to others. While Islamic scholars were building libraries and advancing science, in Europe, the so-called Dark Ages were in full swing, and much of the scientific knowledge from antiquity was either lost or inaccessible. It wasn't until the Renaissance that Europe began to rediscover many of the texts from the Islamic world, and even then, European scholars often took credit for the knowledge they inherited, erasing the Muslim pioneers from the history books. Take, for example, the spread of coffee. Coffee, as we know it today, was popularized by the Sufi mystics of Yemen in the 15th century. They used it to stay awake during their nighttime prayers, and from there it spread across the Islamic world. By the 16th century, it had made its way into Europe, where it was hailed as a new discovery by Western coffee houses. But the truth is, coffee was first cultivated in the Islamic world, and its transformative effects on social and cultural practices began long before it ever reached European shores. The same goes for the surgical tools and techniques that revolutionized medicine. Muslim physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn al-Nafis made major strides in surgery, developing methods that would later be used in Europe. Ibn al-Nafis, for instance, is credited with discovering the pulmonary circulation of blood in the 13th century. Centuries before, Western scientists like William Harvey made similar discoveries, yet his contributions were largely ignored and the credit went elsewhere. So how did this happen? How did the brilliance of the Islamic Golden Age slip through the cracks of history? It wasn't just a matter of coincidence. European scholars during the Renaissance and beyond had a vested interest in distancing themselves from Islamic culture. During the Crusades, Western Europe and the Muslim world were in direct conflict, and the intellectual contributions of Muslims were often downplayed or rejected. The work of Islamic scholars became tangled in a web of political and religious tensions, and as Europe moved toward the Enlightenment, it chose to emphasize its own achievements while marginalizing the rich legacy of the Islamic world. It's difficult to overstate how important this erasure was for the modern world. By stripping the Islamic world of its contributions, European scholars were not just rewriting history, they were shaping the narrative that would dominate the global understanding of science and culture for centuries. The names of Muslim inventors and intellectuals were left out of textbooks, their works left untranslated, and their legacies silenced. This historical erasure is not just a distant memory, it has real-world consequences. How many people today know that algebra, surgery, and coffee, the things we take for granted, are all rooted in the Islamic world? How many of us understand that these innovations, once forgotten, played a crucial role in shaping the modern world we live in? But the real question isn't why history was erased. It's how we can uncover what has been lost and why this is more important than ever for our understanding of the past. And the next chapter of this story will take us deeper into the life of the inventor whose genius was forgotten. This story isn't just about loss. It's about rediscovery and reclamation. And it starts with the extraordinary life of one man who would go on to change the world, yet remain a ghost in the pages of history. Picture a young boy growing up in the heart of a bustling metropolis. The year is 800 AD, and this city, Baghdad, is a beacon of knowledge in the Islamic world, drawing scholars and thinkers from every corner of the empire. The air is filled with the hum of conversation, the sound of papers rustling, and the weight of intellectual curiosity. This is a place where no question is too bold, and no idea is too impossible. Among these scholars, one young man rises, destined to change the course of history. He is none other than Al-Khwarizmi, a Persian mathematician whose name would one day be immortalized in the term algebra. But back then, he was just another scholar, eager to unlock the mysteries of the world. Growing up in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age, Al-Khwarizmi was surrounded by a climate of intellectual exchange and opportunity. Baghdad was home to the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where scholars gathered to translate ancient texts and explore new ideas in science, mathematics, and philosophy. This was a time when the pursuit of knowledge was seen as a sacred duty. The Quran itself encourages learning and reflection, and it was within this environment of intellectual ferment that Al-Khwarizmi began to develop his groundbreaking ideas. But what made his work so revolutionary? It wasn't just the introduction of algebra, it was the way in which he transformed mathematics from a static set of rules into a dynamic problem-solving tool. At the time, mathematics was primarily concerned with practical calculations, how to measure land, distribute wealth, and keep track of the heavens. But Al-Khwarizmi saw something more in these numbers. He began to create a system that would allow for the manipulation of equations and the solution of problems. His work on Algebra, the word from which we get algebra, laid the foundation for solving equations, and with it, a new era of mathematical thought began. Al-Khwarizmi's system wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a practical tool for society. His algebra helped engineers, merchants, and astronomers perform calculations they never could have imagined before. But Al-Khwarizmi's impact wasn't confined to the world of numbers. He also had a profound influence on medicine. In the same way that his algebra transformed the way people thought about numbers, his medical contributions revolutionized how doctors treated disease. One of his key innovations was the introduction of new surgical tools and techniques that would later form the basis for modern surgery. In his time, medical knowledge was often limited to a small circle of scholars, but Al-Khwarizmi's work was different. He reached out to those on the fringes of the academic world, doctors, surgeons, and pharmacists, and brought their knowledge into the fold of scholarly practice. This was a breakthrough that would lay the groundwork for centuries of medical advancement. But it wasn't just in the world of medicine and mathematics that Al-Khwarizmi would leave his mark. He also had a hand in the spread of coffee. Yes, you heard that right. Coffee. While coffee cultivation is often credited to the Sufi mystics of Yemen, it was Al-Khwarizmi's work in the field of botany and trade that played a key role in bringing coffee from the Arabian Peninsula to the rest of the world. In a time when coffee was primarily consumed by Muslim communities, its journey from the Middle East to Europe was made possible through a complex network of trade and intellectual exchange, much of it facilitated by scholars like Al-Khwarizmi. Imagine for a moment, every time you sip your coffee, you're partaking in the legacy of a man who lived over 1,000 years ago. Every equation you solve, every surgery that saves a life, every moment of focus you achieve from that warm cup in your hand traces its origins back to Al-Khwarizmi. His work was the backbone of entire fields of study, and yet, despite his monumental contributions, he was not widely recognized in his time. His name was often lost in the shadows of history, eclipsed by the political and cultural shifts that followed the Islamic Golden Age. But here's the shocking part. Al-Khwarizmi's name was not the only one left behind. He was just one of many Muslim inventors, thinkers, and scientists whose work shaped the modern world, only to be forgotten by history. This erasure wasn't just a matter of time, it was the result of a deliberate decision to rewrite history. As European scholars began to establish their intellectual dominance during the Renaissance, the contributions of the Islamic world were systematically minimized, ignored, or misattributed. The legacy of men like Al-Khwarizmi, who had shaped the very foundations of modern science, was nearly lost to the sands of time. So, how did a man who revolutionized mathematics, medicine, and even coffee end up forgotten? The answer lies not just in the passage of time, but in the forces of politics, religion, and cultural conflict that sought to suppress the true origins of these great ideas. Al-Khwarizmi's story is not just one of genius, it is a story of erasure, of a legacy stolen from history. But this is only the beginning of the story. You see, Al-Khwarizmi's contributions were not just groundbreaking, they were also transformative, setting the stage for the revolution in scientific thought that would later emerge in Europe. And while his work was suppressed in the West, his influence would continue to ripple through time. The question now is not just about how his name disappeared, but about what happened to his groundbreaking ideas after his death. The next part of this story will take you on a journey through the incredible rise of Al-Khwarizmi's recognition, his eventual fall from grace, and the tragic circumstances that left him forgotten, even as the world continued to benefit from his work. The story of Al-Khwarizmi doesn't end with his groundbreaking contributions. It takes a darker turn. After his pioneering work in mathematics and medicine, one might think that recognition and fame would follow. Yet, as we trace the trajectory of his life, we see a troubling pattern. A genius whose ideas were too advanced for their time, whose legacy would be swept away by the currents of political, social, and cultural change. Al-Khwarizmi's work on algebra, particularly his method for solving linear and quadratic equations, became the bedrock for future mathematical development. He was more than just a mathematician. He was an architect of modern thought, creating a system that would lay the groundwork for both the scientific revolution in Europe and the digital age. The word algebra itself comes from his seminal work, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. In his treatise, Al-Khwarizmi presented a structured, systematic approach to solving equations, giving birth to a discipline that would later be applied in fields as diverse as engineering, economics, and computer science. Imagine the ripple effects of this. In the 9th century, no one could have predicted that a book written in Arabic would shape the structure of mathematics for centuries to come. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra wasn't just a new mathematical language, it was a new way of thinking. His methods provided a framework that would be used by future mathematicians in both the Islamic world and eventually in Europe. But here's where the irony begins. While Al-Khwarizmi's work was spreading across the Islamic world, making its way into the hands of mathematicians and scholars, it was not immediately recognized by the wider world. In fact, it wasn't until European scholars translated his texts centuries later that the true significance of his work began to be understood in the West. But even then, his contributions were overshadowed by the broader narrative of European intellectual progress. One of the most remarkable aspects of Al-Khwarizmi's story is the fact that his algebra didn't just change the way people approach mathematics, it was a tool that transformed the very fabric of medieval society. During the Islamic Golden Age, algebra was applied in a wide range of practical areas, from astronomy and engineering to commerce and agriculture. Merchants relied on Al-Khwarizmi's equations to calculate profits, while engineers used his methods to design buildings and canals. His work in algebra was far from abstract. It was directly tied to the prosperity of the Islamic world. But despite this widespread application, Al-Khwarizmi did not live to see the full impact of his work. While he was respected in his own time, his fame was not the kind that would bring him wealth or recognition. In fact, he passed away in relative obscurity, his contributions largely overlooked by history. He was not remembered as the brilliant inventor he was, but as just another scholar in the vast intellectual tradition of the Islamic Golden Age. However, this lack of recognition didn't stop the ripple effect of his work from spreading. Al-Khwarizmi's influence began to penetrate deeper into Europe, particularly during the Middle Ages, Renaissance, when European scholars rediscovered the texts of the Islamic world. It was at this point that his work in algebra, as well as his contributions to astronomy and geography, began to gain the attention they deserved. But by then, it was too late for Al-Khwarizmi to receive the credit he so rightly deserved. In fact, the rediscovery of Al-Khwarizmi's algebra was met with a strange irony. European scholars who were quick to acknowledge his influence were just as quick to downplay the contributions of the Islamic world in general. The intellectual tradition that had nurtured Al-Khwarizmi's genius was all but ignored. Instead, the narrative of European intellectual progress became dominant, and the rich legacy of the Islamic world was relegated to the margins. This story, however, is not just one of Al-Khwarizmi's forgotten legacy, it's part of a broader pattern. Throughout history, countless Muslim scholars, inventors, and thinkers have had their names erased or buried. The same mathematical principles that Al-Khwarizmi pioneered were developed and celebrated in the West, but often without crediting their true origin. For example, the concept of zero, which played a crucial role in algebra, was introduced to the West through Arabic numerals, but many Western historians failed to acknowledge the Muslim scholars who had advanced the concept. This erasure of Muslim contributions is not a trivial matter, it has long-lasting consequences. By excluding the true origins of ideas and inventions, we lose a deeper understanding of the world. We miss the chance to fully appreciate the interconnectedness of human knowledge. And perhaps most tragically, we miss the opportunity to honor those who made these incredible advances possible. So, what happened to Al-Khwarizmi's legacy after his death? While his ideas continued to influence mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, the recognition he deserved remained elusive. The The political, social, and cultural shifts of the time played a significant role in his obscurity. As European power and influence grew, the Islamic world's intellectual contributions were systematically downplayed, and the names of Muslim pioneers were erased from the historical record. But this story is not over. Al-Khwarizmi's work still reverberates in the world today, and as we continue to explore his life and legacy, we will uncover the truth behind the erasure of his name, and perhaps discover the powerful impact that his ideas still have on the modern world. So how did Al-Khwarizmi's brilliance, once so central to the intellectual world, become a shadow in history? What happened when the very forces that once celebrated his contributions turned their backs on him? And how can we reclaim this lost legacy, ensuring that the names of forgotten pioneers are remembered for generations to come? The answer, as we'll see, lies not just in the pages of history, but in the way we choose to remember the past and acknowledge the true architects of our modern world. But the story doesn't end here. The erasure of Al-Khwarizmi's legacy didn't just stop at him. It extended far beyond his lifetime, affecting generations of brilliant thinkers who were swept aside by the tides of history. And as we dive deeper into the consequences of this forgotten history, we'll uncover how the legacy of Islamic innovation was buried, leaving generations to rediscover what had already been lost. Al-Khwarizmi's legacy, despite his groundbreaking contributions, would soon fade into the shadows of history. After a life spent shaping mathematics, medicine, and even everyday life through inventions like algebra and coffee, his death came quietly, largely unnoticed by the world he had so profoundly impacted. But what had happened? How could a man who had revolutionized the intellectual landscape of his time die in poverty, forgotten by the very society that benefited from his genius? Let's return to the last years of his life. By the time Al-Khwarizmi passed away, the world was beginning to change. The intellectual and cultural climate of the Islamic world, which had once celebrated scholars like him, was starting to shift. The caliphate's political and military power was weakening. New dynasties were rising, and with them came a change in priorities. The once thriving centers of learning like Baghdad began to lose their prominence. As political unrest grew, the House of Wisdom, where Al-Khwarizmi had once worked alongside some of the greatest minds of his time, began to lose its luster. And then there was the rise of European powers, beginning to reclaim their role in the world after centuries of relative obscurity during the so-called Dark Ages. Europe was coming out of its intellectual dormancy, and with it came a rise in Western chauvinism. European scholars, in their eagerness to assert their cultural superiority, began rewriting history. The great contributions of the Islamic Golden Age were not just ignored, but actively downplayed. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name had once been revered in the Islamic world, became nothing more than a footnote in a story increasingly told through a European lens. The very ideas Al-Khwarizmi had championed, the essence of algebra, the surgical tools that saved lives, and the foundations of the global coffee culture, became part of a larger European intellectual narrative. His brilliant contributions, instead of being cherished and remembered, were either misattributed or erased altogether. The most tragic part of Al-Khwarizmi's erasure was how it played into the cultural and intellectual competition between the East and the West. At the time of his death, the Islamic world was in decline, and as it faltered, the West was just beginning its renaissance, a rebirth of intellectual and artistic achievement. This period saw European scholars rediscovering the scientific texts of the Islamic world. But instead of acknowledging the true, originators of this knowledge, these European scholars, some unknowingly, others deliberately, claimed the credit for discoveries made centuries earlier by Muslim thinkers. But what happened to Al-Khwarizmi in all of this? Why was he forgotten so quickly, even though his influence was felt so strongly across multiple fields? The answer lies partly in the way history was recorded and rewritten in the centuries following his death. During the height of the Islamic Golden Age, many of the great thinkers, including Al-Khwarizmi, worked in a world where knowledge was passed down orally and through manuscript. It wasn't until centuries later, when Europe began its push towards scholarly recognition, that these contributions were systematically reclaimed by the West. This process of cultural appropriation and intellectual conquest is where Al-Khwarizmi's name became lost. The West, in its growing dominance, rewrote history in its own image. Instead of acknowledging the rich intellectual heritage of the Islamic world, they whitewashed it, conveniently forgetting the Muslim pioneers who had laid the foundation for the scientific breakthroughs that were now being credited to Europe. While names like Galileo, Copernicus and Newton became synonymous with the scientific revolution, Al-Khwarizmi and his fellow Muslim thinkers were relegated to the background. Even the very tools Al-Khwarizmi invented, his methods of solving algebraic equations, were rebranded by European mathematicians and celebrated as their own innovations. The term algebra itself was adopted into the European lexicon, but no one bothered to mention its Arabic roots or the man who first systematized it. Al-Khwarizmi's contributions to surgery were no different. His work on surgical instruments, which was pioneering in its time, became the basis for the tools used by European surgeons centuries later. But again, his name was lost in the shuffle. His innovations were not celebrated in his lifetime, and even his death went largely unnoticed. He died in obscurity, and while his work would continue to echo throughout history, it would do so without his name attached. This is where the true tragedy of Al-Khwarizmi's life unfolds, not just in his obscurity during his final years, but in the deliberate erasure of his legacy. His contributions were invaluable to the modern world, but his name was left behind, overshadowed by the rising dominance of European intellectualism. And what's more tragic is that the very society he had once helped to thrive, the Islamic world, began to lose touch with its own intellectual roots. But let's not forget, Al-Khwarizmi's work wasn't simply lost to time. It continued to influence the world long after his death. Though his name faded, his ideas persisted, quietly shaping the development of mathematics, medicine, and more. Al-Khwarizmi may not have received the recognition he deserved in his time, but his intellectual legacy would survive, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone to uncover it. And while his story may seem one of loss and obscurity, there is a powerful message here. Al-Khwarizmi's erasure is part of a larger pattern of cultural and intellectual forgetting that has often silenced the voices of non-European thinkers. But as we rediscover his legacy, we begin to see the true value of his work, not just in the past, but in the present and future. What happened next, though, is the most astonishing part of this story. Al-Khwarizmi's work, forgotten and suppressed for centuries, began to be rediscovered in the modern era, and with it came the opportunity to right a historical wrong. What happens when we reclaim this lost history? How does rediscovering the contributions of forgotten pioneers like Al-Khwarizmi change the way we see the world today? The journey of reclaiming lost history doesn't stop here. As we move forward, we will uncover how the very erasure of Al-Khwarizmi's legacy has had lasting effects on how we view Islamic contributions to the modern world. And we'll explore how today we can begin to rewrite the narrative and bring these forgotten names back into the light. But what does that mean for us today? How do we confront this erasure? And what does it teach us about how we preserve and share our stories? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the human impact of this erasure and explore the long-term consequences of losing our collective memory. The influence of Al-Khwarizmi's innovations did not remain confined to the realm of scholars and intellectuals. His work permeated the very fabric of everyday life, shaping the world in ways that ordinary people could never have imagined. Though his name remained largely forgotten, the tools he invented would go on to impact lives in profound and often unseen ways. Let's begin with algebra, the foundation of countless modern disciplines. Imagine you are a merchant in the bustling markets of medieval Baghdad. You're trading goods across the empire, from spices to textiles, and you need to keep track of your profits, expenses, and inventory. The complex world of commerce requires precision, and Al-Khwarizmi's algebra is the very tool you would use. The equations he developed allowed traders like you to calculate cost, profit margins, and exchange rates, transforming the way business was conducted. Algebra wasn't just for merchants, it was the backbone of administration and governance. Imagine being a tax collector in the court of a caliph, tasked with managing the wealth of an entire province. Without Al-Khwarizmi's system, calculating taxes, allocating resources, and organizing the empire's wealth would have been an impossibility. His work brought order and efficiency to the Islamic world, making governance and commerce possible on an unprecedented scale. As you walk through these markets or witness the precise calculations of a government official, you might not realize that these systems are rooted in the very algebra al-Khwarizmi developed. But every time a transaction occurs, a contract is signed, or a tax is collected, al-Khwarizmi's legacy is quietly present in the background, influencing the workings of society in ways that are taken for granted today. But his influence wasn't limited to mathematics. Think about the medical breakthroughs that saved lives across the Muslim world, and eventually, the Western world. Imagine being a doctor in a bustling hospital in Cordoba, Spain, or Cairo, Egypt. You are dealing with patients suffering from ailments that, by today's standards, would be impossible to treat. But thanks to al-Khwarizmi's work, you have access to a more sophisticated understanding of anatomy and surgery. Al-Khwarizmi's contributions to medicine were not just theoretical, they were practical and revolutionary. He developed surgical tools that would be used for centuries and wrote extensively on surgical procedures. Surgeons in his time, guided by his principles, could perform operations that had once been impossible. This was not just a matter of theoretical knowledge, these were life-saving innovations. Imagine a young child who might have died from an infection in the early medieval period, but instead survives thanks to the use of antiseptic tools and techniques based on al-Khwarizmi's work. His contributions to surgery would later influence European medical practices. Yet, even as Europe rediscovered the work of Islamic scholars, al-Khwarizmi remained an obscure figure in the history books. Still, the impact of his innovations would echo through time, with generations of doctors and surgeons benefiting from the tools and techniques he introduced. And then there's coffee, the simple yet profound beverage that has become a staple in modern life. The story of how coffee entered Europe is tied directly to the Islamic world and, indirectly, to al-Khwarizmi. Though coffee is often credited to Sufi mystics of Yemen, it was the intellectual environment of the Islamic world, where trade and intellectual exchange flourished, that allowed coffee to spread. It was Muslim traders, working in the networks established by scholars like al-Khwarizmi, who brought coffee to the European continent. Today, coffee is a cultural cornerstone in nearly every corner of the globe. Whether in a cafe in Paris, a meeting room in New York, or a bustling street corner in Cairo, coffee brings people together. It fuels late-night study sessions, early morning meetings, and casual conversations. Imagine how many moments in your own life, your work, your studies, your friendships, have been shaped by the simple, everyday ritual of coffee. The warm cup you hold in your hands today is, in part, a tribute to the world that al-Khwarizmi helped create. But these stories aren't just about numbers, surgeries, or cups of coffee. They are about people, real lives that were changed by the contributions of a forgotten genius. The merchants whose trade was made possible by algebra, the doctors whose lives were saved by surgical innovations, and the millions of people across the world who drink coffee every day. All of these individuals owe something to al-Khwarizmi. His inventions were not academic exercises. They were tools that touched lives, that helped people survive, thrive, and build civilizations. Imagine now the emotional impact of all these advancements. Picture yourself in the shoes of a physician in the Islamic Golden Age. You're not just learning medicine, you're learning how to save lives in ways that were previously unimaginable. Picture the joy of a merchant when they successfully calculate a profit, or the relief of a student who understands the beauty of mathematics through algebra. These are the quiet victories that shape the daily lives of people in the Islamic world, and, through trade and intellectual exchange, the rest of the world as well. But the human impact doesn't stop there. The effects of al-Khwarizmi's work are still felt in the modern world. Today, algebra forms the bedrock of modern technology, from computers to cryptography. The medical tools and techniques he introduced have been refined over centuries, saving millions of lives. And coffee, yes, coffee, is a cultural, social, and economic powerhouse today, with the global coffee market worth over $100 billion annually. As you reflect on this, the enormity of al-Khwarizmi's legacy becomes clearer. He didn't just shape the intellectual world, he shaped the very rhythms of daily life. His contributions to algebra, medicine, and even coffee reverberate through time, affecting everyone, whether they know it or not. And yet, despite the profound human impact of his work, al-Khwarizmi's name remains largely forgotten. This is the tragedy of intellectual erasure. The true architects of history go unrecognized, while their contributions quietly shape the world around us. But this is not the end of his story. The question now is, how do we honor the lives that were touched by Al-Khwarizmi's genius? How do we acknowledge the profound impact of his work on the modern world? As we move forward, we will begin to uncover the hidden consequences of this historical erasure. We'll explore what happens when a culture forgets its intellectual giants, and the long-term impact that has on our collective memory. But before we dive into that, think about the lives that were saved, the businesses that thrived, and the culture that developed in part because of the work of one man who was lost to history. That, in itself, is a story worth reclaiming. Al-Khwarizmi's legacy, though woven into the fabric of modern life, was long obscured by the forces of historical erasure. His algebra, surgical innovations, and the spread of coffee impacted millions, yet his name faded into obscurity. The question now is not just why his legacy was erased, but what were the lasting consequences of this erasure? What does it mean for a civilization's contributions to be deliberately forgotten, and how does it affect the collective identity of the people who birthed them? Imagine a world where you grow up learning that the most important ideas and discoveries in science, mathematics, and medicine were made by others, not your ancestors. In this world, the contributions of your civilization are erased, and the achievements of other cultures are given more prominence. This was the fate that befell the Islamic world after the decline of its intellectual dominance, as Europe slowly began to reclaim its own identity. The erasure of Al-Khwarizmi and others like him is not just a footnote in history, it is a tragedy with profound long-term effects on how the world views its collective history. When we lose touch with the intellectual roots of our past, we also lose a part of our identity. For centuries, the great achievements of the Islamic world were overshadowed by European narratives that sought to place the West at the center of all progress. The scientific, mathematical, and medical advancements of the Islamic Golden Age were not just reduced in significance, they were erased. This deliberate suppression has had lasting repercussions, not only for the Muslim world, but for the entire global understanding of intellectual history. Take, for example, the impact on Muslim identity. Imagine being part of a community that has made monumental contributions to the world in science, medicine, and mathematics, only to see those contributions attributed to others. It's more than just a historical oversight. It's a blow to the sense of pride and cultural heritage. For centuries, Muslim scholars who were once revered for their pioneering work have been relegated to the margins of history. Their accomplishments, Al-Khwarizmi's algebra, Avicenna's medicine, and Al-Razi's surgery, are often presented as Arab or Persian contributions, not as part of a unified Islamic intellectual tradition. The erasure of their names has left a void, depriving Muslim communities of the opportunity to celebrate their intellectual heritage and share it with the world. This cultural amnesia has had a profound effect on how Muslims view themselves in the context of global history. Instead of recognizing that the intellectual foundations of the modern world were built on the work of Muslim scholars, many Muslims grew up in a world that minimized or ignored their contributions. For generations, this erasure has created a sense of intellectual inferiority, a feeling that their civilization's contributions to global knowledge were somehow secondary or less significant than those of Europe. But the consequences go beyond cultural identity. The erasure of Al-Khwarizmi and other Muslim pioneers also impacts how the modern world understands its own history. The scientific revolution in Europe, which is often seen as the birth of modern science, was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of centuries of intellectual development that began in the Islamic world. Many of the ideas that Europeans took credit for during the Renaissance were directly inherited from Muslim scholars. But because European historians largely ignored or downplayed the Islamic contributions, modern scholars are often unaware of the deep debt the West owes to the Islamic Golden Age. Take, for example, the concept of zero, which was central to the development of algebra. The introduction of zero into European mathematics was an essential part of the scientific revolution, but this concept was first developed by Islamic mathematicians, who inherited it from ancient Indian scholars. Without zero, there would be no algebra, no calculus, no modern computing. Yet the Islamic world's role in this development is often overlooked in favor of the European narrative, which credits Western thinkers for innovations that were, in reality, built on a foundation laid by Muslim scholars. The suppression of Islamic contributions to mathematics, medicine, and science has also created a gap in modern educational systems. How many students today learn that the very algebra they use in their high school classrooms owes its existence to al-Khwarizmi? How many understand that the surgical techniques and tools used in modern medicine have their origins in the work of Islamic scholars like Al-Razi? And how many people are aware that the coffee they drink, which is now a global cultural phenomenon, was first cultivated in the Islamic world? These fundamental aspects of our daily lives are not just a product of Western ingenuity. They are part of a broader, shared intellectual heritage that spans cultures and civilizations. The erasure of al-Khwarizmi's contributions is not just an academic oversight, it is a cultural wound that has affected the way we view our collective history. It's a wound that can only begin to heal when we acknowledge the truth that the Islamic world played a pivotal role in shaping the modern world. By rediscovering and celebrating the lost legacies of figures like al-Khwarizmi, we not only reclaim a piece of history, but also honor the intellectual achievements of an entire civilization. This historical erasure also has practical consequences for how we approach the preservation of knowledge today. If we fail to acknowledge the true origins of key ideas and inventions, we risk perpetuating the myth that certain cultures or civilizations are more important than others in the shaping of global history. The erasure of Islamic contributions is a reminder that the history we are taught is not always the whole story, and that we must be vigilant in questioning the narratives we inherit. But the most striking consequence of this erasure is the way it has stunted intellectual progress in the Muslim world itself. By disconnecting from its own rich intellectual tradition, the Muslim world has struggled to find its place in modern scholarship and scientific discovery. When a civilization forgets its own great minds, it is deprived of the intellectual resources that could inspire future generations. And when those contributions are erased from the historical record, it becomes harder for new generations to build on the work of their predecessors. The path to reclaiming al-Khwarizmi's legacy and the broader intellectual heritage of the Islamic Golden Age begins with rediscovery. By acknowledging the true origins of the ideas that have shaped the modern world, we can begin to repair the cultural wounds that have been inflicted by centuries of erasure. As we move forward, we must ensure that these lost names like al-Khwarizmi are not forgotten again. We must honor their work, their ideas, and their legacy, so that future generations will know the truth, that the brilliance of the Islamic world is not a thing of the past. It is a living, breathing part of our shared intellectual heritage. But the true question is not just how we reclaim the past, it's how we ensure that this erasure never happens again. As we begin to rediscover the lost contributions of Islamic scholars, we are faced with the challenge of rewriting history in a way that reflects the full, true story. And in the next chapter, we will explore how these forgotten legacies are being uncovered in the modern world, and what that means for our collective future. The story of al-Khwarizmi's contributions doesn't end in the dusty archives of history. His work, once forgotten, then rediscovered, continues to shape the modern world in ways most people never consider. Algebra, surgical techniques, and even the coffee we drink daily all trace their origins back to the genius of al-Khwarizmi. But the question remains, how do his inventions and ideas influence us today in an age where technology, medicine, and culture have reached new heights? Let's begin with algebra, the very tool al-Khwarizmi pioneered. Imagine the world without it. We wouldn't have computers, smartphones, or the very apps you use every day. Algebra, as al-Khwarizmi envisioned it, provided the foundation for the digital age. Every algorithm, every line of code, every piece of data manipulation in modern technology relies on the principles of algebra. The field of computer science, which drives the tech revolution we're living in, owes its existence to the work of al-Khwarizmi. He didn't just change mathematics, he created the blueprint for the digital world. Algebra's application in computing is just one example of how his work reverberates through modern industries. Take cryptography, for example. In our digital age, encryption is essential for everything from online banking to private communications. The very concept of encryption relies on algebraic principles that trace their lineage directly back to al-Khwarizmi's algebraic equations. In a world where cyber threats and data breaches are increasingly common, the systems that protect our information are built on foundations laid by a Muslim inventor whose name many have forgotten. Now, think about the world of medicine. Today, surgical techniques and medical tools continue to evolve, saving countless lives. But Al-Khwarizmi's influence on medicine is still present, particularly in the tools he pioneered. His innovations in surgical instruments, which were refined over time by generations of physicians, laid the groundwork for the sophisticated tools used by modern surgeons. The scalpels, forceps, and even the very way surgeries are performed today are all built upon the principles established by scholars like Al-Khwarizmi. Even in the realm of anesthesiology and antiseptic techniques, the seeds were planted in the golden age of Islamic science, influenced by the work of pioneers who understood medicine not as a set of abstract theories, but as a practical, life-saving endeavor. Consider the impact of his contributions to these fields. Every surgical success, every saved life in modern medicine is connected to a tradition of healing that stretches back through centuries of Islamic scholarship. The fact that so many modern procedures, from organ transplants to minimally invasive surgeries, are based on principles established by the likes of Al-Khwarizmi is a testament to the lasting power of his work. Yet, his contributions to medicine remain underappreciated by most. And then, there's coffee, the most iconic example of a beverage that has transcended cultures and generations. While it's often associated with the European Renaissance or the American coffeehouse culture, the journey of coffee begins much earlier in the Islamic world. Long before coffeehouses blossomed in London, Paris, or New York, coffee was already a part of the Muslim world's social fabric. The trade routes established by scholars and traders, nurtured by intellectuals like Al-Khwarizmi, played a key role in introducing coffee to Europe. Today, the global coffee industry is worth over $100 billion annually, with millions of people relying on the beverage for their daily ritual. From the morning cup at home to the cafe meetings in urban centres, coffee has become an essential part of global culture. The fact that it was spread across continents through the networks of the Islamic world is often overlooked. The simple act of drinking coffee is a direct connection to a past we too often forget. And the story of its journey across the globe is intertwined with the very legacy of Al-Khwarizmi and his contemporaries. So how do all of these connections tie back to the legacy of one man lost to history? The enduring relevance of his work is undeniable. Algebra laid the foundation for our modern digital world, medical advances continue to build upon Islamic innovations, and coffee remains a vital part of the global cultural exchange. Al-Khwarizmi may have died forgotten, but his work continues to touch lives generation after generation. His contributions were not just groundbreaking, they were world-changing. But here's the real kicker. Despite all of these modern connections, Al-Khwarizmi's name is still not as widely recognized as it should be. The mathematical principles he developed, the medical tools he created, and even the coffee we drink daily, all of this owes itself to the forgotten genius of a Muslim inventor who reshaped the world without ever being truly celebrated. The modern world is connected to the past in ways we often fail to recognize. Al-Khwarizmi's story serves as a reminder of the lost legacies of the past and of how much more we can learn from those who have come before us. Reclaiming these lost histories doesn't just enrich our understanding of the past, it empowers us to better appreciate the ways in which knowledge, innovation, and culture travel across time and space. And as we continue to move forward, it's up to us to ensure that the names of these forgotten figures are finally brought to the forefront. But perhaps the most important question remains: how do we ensure that Al-Khwarizmi's legacy and the legacies of countless other forgotten scholars aren't lost to history again? The next section will delve into how the modern world is beginning to rediscover these forgotten contributions and what it means for the future of knowledge and global culture. Al-Khwarizmi's life was marked by brilliance, yet shadowed by obscurity. His groundbreaking contributions to algebra, medicine, and even the spread of coffee changed the world in profound ways, yet for centuries his name remained largely forgotten. His legacy, though lost in the history books, continues to resonate through the modern world, from the algorithms powering your smartphone to the surgical techniques saving lives. The irony of his life is that while his work still shapes our world, the man himself was not celebrated not remembered. But as we uncover this lost history, we realize that Al-Khwarizmi's story is not just one of erasure. It is a call to action. It's a reminder that history is not a fixed narrative, but one that can be reclaimed. By rediscovering the contributions of forgotten figures like Al-Khwarizmi, we are not only correcting historical injustices, we are ensuring that future generations understand the true depth of human achievement. The erasure of Al-Khwarizmi's name has deep cultural implications, especially for the Muslim world. For centuries, the achievements of Islamic scholars were minimized or ignored by those who dominated the historical narrative. But as we begin to acknowledge the true origins of modern knowledge, we open the door to a more inclusive and accurate understanding of history. This is not just about correcting the record, it's about giving people the recognition they deserve, restoring pride to those whose contributions have been erased. In our modern world, it is essential that we recognize the full scope of human achievement, embracing the diversity of knowledge that has shaped our civilization. The lessons of Al-Khwarizmi's forgotten legacy are clear. We must never forget the innovators who came before us, whose work laid the foundation for the world we live in today. As we look to the future, let us ensure that the intellectual contributions of all cultures are acknowledged, celebrated, and passed on to future generations. Al-Khwarizmi's life and work remind us of something powerful, that the past is never truly gone. It lives in the ideas we carry forward, in the technology we use, in the medicine that saves lives, and in the everyday rituals we often take for granted. Reclaiming the forgotten legacies of the past is not just an act of historical justice. It's a necessary step toward building a more connected and enlightened future. And so, as we close this chapter of history, remember that Al-Khwarizmi, and many like him, may have been forgotten, but their influence, their brilliance, continues to shape our world. It is now up to us to ensure that their names are never lost again.